welcome everyone to our community conversation on the initial token swap. I'm Pete Lidwell. I'm a product manager here at Affinity, and I'm also joined here by Lara, who's a researcher on the SNS team. And together we're going to introduce you to the proposal of what we're calling the initial token swap as part of the SNS solution. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to do a quick recap of the SNS to put this proposal in some context. We're going to run through a quick outline of the problem and the motivation for what we're trying to solve as part of the initial token swap. Then we'll run you through the swap proposal, and then we'll leave some time for a good amount of time for feedback and any questions you have. As part of housekeeping, the chat's open. Please feel free to post questions there. There's also Q&A, so you can post questions there. Do that during the talk, and we'll record them, and then we'll answer them at the end of the talk. Just a quick disclaimer also that we may touch on some topics that may stray towards what might be construed as legal or tax advice. And we want to just say that there is no legal or tax advice in this presentation. Every project will have to do its own due diligence in the jurisdictions or jurisdiction it operates in. So this is not, there's no legal or tax advice in this presentation. So just to start off with a quick recap on the SNS. So the SNS introduces the concept of builds on what we've learned from building the NNS governance, and the SNS brings some of those learnings to the management of applications as opposed to running the IC. So whilst where the NNS is responsible for governing the functions of the IC, an SNS is responsible for the governance of a specific DApp. The core of the SNS is adapted versions of the governance and ledger canisters, which support the setup and running of a DApp. And each DApp, to be clear, has its own service nervous system. Just also to remind everyone that there are some unique characteristics that the SNS and IC brings to the world of Web3 and DAOs. As the IC can host the DApp fully on chain, the SNS can actually control the DApp directly. So proposals are not merely votes, but actually are executable updates to the DApp itself. So DApps in essence do really become autonomous and on chain and truly user owned and controlled. To achieve this, the ledger and the governance canister of the SNS support decentralization through tokenization, which is what the ledger canister is there to support. Going in a little bit more detail, the governance canister supports two core concepts. The idea of proposals, which are executable upgrades and change the functionality of the DApp, and neurons, which are able to vote on those proposals, neurons being created by users staking their DApp tokens. On the other side, we have the ledger. Each SNS comes with its own token and a ledger to support this token. The SNS ledger, like any other ledger, has two core functions. One is to support the ownership of tokens in accounts, and the other is to support the transfer of those transferring of token ownerships, including the act of staking and creating neurons. The ledger today is modeled on the ICP ledger, although we're in a separate we are tracking the new token ledger standard, and the SNS ledger will intend to support the new token standard. So as projects create SNSs, these tokens should naturally plug into the wider ecosystem of wallets and DeFi apps, including exchanges. The ledger standard is kind of being discussed right now and evolving, and if you want to be involved in that, then I would recommend trying to join the ledger standards working group. that was pretty much where what was the original plan for the SNS project, that we were going to build these ledger and governance canisters and allow the projects to bring up their own instances of an SNS. As we were going through the sort of final stages of planning, it sort of became clear there was a general problem that more projects were going to face, and then it makes sense for us to provide some sort of solution to that. And I'm going to, the big problem is really like, how do you transition from a project where developers are controlling a DApp or an app at that point, I guess, into this kind of world of a DAO-controlled autonomous application, or actually a DApp at that point. And it's a problem that every project is going to face. And we felt it was important to include a solution to this process as part of the actual first release of the SNS. Just going through sort of some of the properties that this transition is going to need to support. So first of all, this process needs to sort of hand over the control from the developers to the SNS managed DAO in a seamless and coherent way, without too many sort of hiccups in that flow. We need to create a new governance token. We need to widely distribute that token to new members of the SNS DAO. We want to allow projects to raise funds to support the continued development of the project, and put the project on a financially stable footing, effectively creating an endowment or a treasury to further fund development. And lastly, we want the process to seem fair and transparent, which is a subjective statement, but as you'll see later in the design, you'll see how we incorporate some safeguards for the community to be able to decide and evolve what a fair launch looks like. So I'm going to dive in, having kind of outlined the SNS and the problem statement that we're trying to solve. I'm going to dive now into more detail around the actual initial token swap proposal. So at a high level, there are three phases of this transition. There's a phase of initialization. There's a phase of when the period of this initial token swap, and then the final stage, which is actually an operational SNS. So in initialization, we would expect projects and developers to set up this initialized SNS, then configure how they want it to run, how they want the whole process to run, and then there's various configuration parameters we'll go through in a minute. And crucially, the application or DApp is handed over to this initialized SNS. In the second stage, the NNS is responsible for running a process of decentralizing the control. During this process, developers remain in control of this initialized SNS. And then lastly, a full operational SNS is created, so the genesis of the SNS DAO. There's two crucial points in this kind of flow. How do you transition from initialization into the swap period, and how do you transition from the swap period into an operational SNS? The first transition is controlled by it will be controlled by an NNS proposal. So this is an opportunity for the community to review the proposed SNS, review the configuration parameters, and you'll have a wisdom of the crowd on whether this is going to be a good and fair launch. And then the second transition occurs at the end of a successful swap. And we'll go a little bit into details as to what constitutes a successful swap later in the talk. So the rest of the talk is going to focus mainly on the actual swap and not on these two other phases. What are the goals of this initial token swap specifically? We want it to be open, so the participation is open to anyone in the wider ICP community. Anyone with ICP can participate. We want it to be fair, specifically that everybody pays the same price in this initial token swap. That the funds are raised for the project, and the control of these funds is the control of this fund is transferred to the project at the end of the swap period. It should be very clear to everybody what the exit criteria are for a successful swap, and the outcome should be a decentralized governance. At least initially, sufficient tokens need to be allocated to voting neurons and not as liquid tokens. So this is kind of like a fairly like involved slide with lots of details on it. So I'm going to dive in a little. I may miss or gloss over some details in here. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. So going over again, so stage one, there's a kind of this initialization phase. And in this initialization phase, we're creating the ledger canister, we're creating an SNS governance canister. The swap canister is also created, although this is a temporary canister that will only exist for the lifespan and duration of the actual decentralization process. We allocate tokens so that after the ledger is created, tokens are allocated to the swap. They're allocated to what we're calling the treasury of the SNS. And lastly, they're also allocated to some neurons specified by the developers. These neurons exist at this point in this flow so that the developers can remain in control of the DApp during the swap period. And the second thing that will happen in this initialization phase is the DApp is actually controlled. The DApp control is handed over to this initialized or proto SNS. Once all of this configuration has been, once the canisters have been set up, the initial configuration is defined, and then an S proposal will be submitted to transition into the next phase, which will be the swap period. Once in the swap period, the swappers, as in the sort of end users that want to participate in the swap and acquire tokens, SNS tokens, will deposit ICP into the swap canister. And this carries on until the end criteria of the swap are met. And then when the swap ends, we transition into decentralized operations. At this point, the ICP in the swap is transferred into the treasury of the project. The tokens, the SNS tokens, are distributed into neurons and allocated to the participants in the swap, the end users that participate in the swap. And finally, the control for the treasury is handed over to the actual autonomous SNS at that point. And now I'm just going to go through, I'm going to go through a sort of more step-by-step explanation of the more detailed interactions with the swap canister. So I'm going to start with what are the parameters by which you can set up a swap. So the first thing you need to specify as a project would be how many tokens that you want to allocate into this sale or swap. The second thing that you might want to specify is the maximum number of ICP that you will accept in this swap. You also want to specify the minimum. You also want to specify the maximum number of ICP per participant, the minimum per participant, and min and max numbers of participants. Lastly, you'll be able to specify a max duration for this swap. So if you look at those parameters, you can break them down into sort of 3 sets of parameters that define different behaviors of the swap. The first set are parameters that basically determine when the swap ends. These are the max duration. Obviously, if you hit the end of the duration, the swap would end. But also, if you hit the maximum number of ICP, then that would also trigger the end of a swap prior to that duration time. The maximum ICP also acts as effectively a guarantee on the upper bound of the price. So you can specify that you don't want people to pay more than XYZ ICP for your token. The second set of parameters would be parameters that determine if the swap succeeds. These would be the minimum number of participants that you want to participate in the swap. So this would determine really the level of decentralization that you want out of this swap sale. The second will be the minimum amount of ICP. So that effectively also sets a lower bound on the price for your token. So the minimum you're prepared to accept. And lastly, there's the last set of parameters are those that control how users can participate. So there's a minimum number of ICP per participant and the maximum to become a buyer. So now running through sort of like in more detail exactly what is happening under the covers between the swap canister, the ledger canisters, the SNS and the NNS. So at the beginning of the swap, there are some neurons and there are some accounts created. These are the developer neurons and the developer accounts. There's also a certain number of tokens that are allocated to the swap, and there's a certain number of tokens that are allocated to the treasury. And you can see in the swap state here, where we're going to focus mainly on the swap state and the swap canister. Those tokens you can see in the purple box. Those are the SNS tokens that have been allocated to the swap. To participate in the swap, the user needs to make a transfer on the NNS ledger. So they're transferring ICP from their account to the swap canister. The user then also needs to notify the swap canister that the transfer has taken place. The transfer is going into a sub account that's controlled by the swap canister, and so the notification is a key part of the flow to let the swap canister know that these tokens have been transferred. More users do the same. So there are now more users with sub accounts in the swap state, in the swap canister, and you can see that the sum of ICP is starting to accumulate in the swap canister. At the end of the swap, when the deadline is reached or the target number of ICP has been reached, the swap effectively ends. And at this point, you have an exchange rate that's been defined. Effectively, the price of the DApp tokens has been set. Very much like an AM, sort of automated market maker in a DEX. The basic assumption is that both pools of tokens have equal value, and so the exchange rate is defined by that ratio of ICP to SNS tokens. And to be clear, everybody in the swap will end up with a pro-rated allocation of the SNS tokens, depending on the proportion of the overall ICP that's raised that they personally put into the swap. So now we have to sort of swap has ended. So now we have to unwind the swap and execute and allocate everything in the right place. So by the way, the order is not necessarily important. So we're going to talk through it in steps, but it could be executed in a different order. So first of all, here the participants in the swap, their ICP is now swapped for SNS tokens. So now you can see that the users now have SNS tokens and not ICP. Those tokens are now for each user transferred to a Neuron account. So each user now has tokens in an account. Each one of those accounts has a neuron created, so users now have neurons and tokens. And you can see that reflected here with the neurons are now created. And then lastly, the ICP in the swap is now transferred to the SNS treasury. You can see here on the left-hand side, the transfer to the treasury. The actual flow is from the swap canister into the NNS ledger. And now we see that there are now no tokens left in the swap canister. To complete the SNS genesis, we remove some of the restrictions that were imposed on the governance canister at the beginning. So when the governance canister was created, it didn't have full control of its ledger. That was one of the precautions that we will put in place to ensure that during the swap period, the ledger is effectively frozen for the SNS. And at Genesis time, that restriction is removed, and the SNS is now effectively an autonomous DAO, now fully in control of its own ledger and the DApp that it controls. Just want to run through a few failure scenarios. There are some points along this flow where there's some decisions that are made. The first point is so after you've initialized the SNS, there is an NNS proposal, and that could be rejected. So if that's rejected, what happens? We would propose that we clean things up, and that the state basically goes back to before the NNS creation. The control is handed back to the principals that control the DApp before they handed the control over to the SNS, to the proto-SNS. The second point at which you could potentially have a failure is if the swap fails, if it doesn't meet its criteria around minimum amounts of ICP or minimum number of participants, then we have a failure case again. At that point again, we would return the DApp back to the principals that were controlling it beforehand, and the tokens in the swap would also be returned to their respective account holders. All the participants would receive their ICP back. Just to I'm going to kind of quickly recap, and then we can go over to questions maybe. So to recap, there are 3 phases to this transition. There's the SNS, the setup, a swap period, and then decentralized operations afterwards. At the setup, the canisters are created, the tokens are initially allocated, the DApp is handed over, the SNS runs in an initialized mode with some restrictions around access to the ledger or the project treasury. The initial token swap is then initiated by an NNS proposal, which the swap is effectively run by the NNS at that point, and it's open to anyone in the ICP community to participate. During that period, the developers are still in control of their DApp via the developer neurons that have been created in the initial phase. And then finally, if there's a successful swap, all of the neurons are created for all of the swappers. The governance restrictions are lifted. The project treasury is now under the SNS ledger is under the full control of the SNS, and the DApp is also under the control of the SNS, and the SNS is effectively now autonomous. So I'm going to move on to feedback and discussion. Just to say that there is also a forum post that we put out a few days ago called the SNS Initial Token Swap. And you can find that on the Dfinity forum. So feel free to also post comments and constructive suggestions there.
Okay, shall we dive into the questions then? So first, there are a few questions regarding the treasury. The first question is, after the swap, every token will be either in the treasury or in a neuron. So that effectively means no user has a liquid token. So what about dApps where the users actually need tokens to perform functions in the dApp? So basically outside of governance. Isn't it a concern that there are no circulating tokens?
Yeah, we're looking at that at the moment, and it's possible that first of all, that we assign tokens in sort of a layered approach to neurons with different result delays. And it's very possible that we have a very short delay set of neurons, or possibly even liquid tokens, but we're looking at that at the moment.
Then a follow-up question is, what exactly is the treasury? And can you maybe give an example of what you would do with these tokens?
So treasury is really just sort of a ledger account or a set of ledger accounts that's under control of the SNS. And those can be both the dApps tokens itself, and they can also be other ledgers. So, for example, the ICP that was raised in the swap would also be in what we're calling the treasury. And this is really sort of like the project's endowment, and it's pretty much free to do what it wants to do with that with that treasury. If the project itself wishes to distribute tokens or sell more tokens or allocate tokens in other ways, it's free to kind of propose motions on how to handle that. We certainly see that with maybe with the ICP, that it could be potentially sent to a DEX and sold and raised and money raised to continue development of the project. But really, this is really open to the project to decide as to how they want to manage the treasury and for what purposes.
Mm-hmm. I think this nicely leads to the next question. So the funds that are in the treasury, how can they actually be used? So do each of those does every transfer need to be approved by an SNS proposal, basically, or how would this work?
So, I mean, certainly, I would imagine that some transfers would need to be approved by a proposal, but it's certainly possible to also automate various parts of this. So that, the dApp itself could be handed control of a portion of the treasury, and in that case, then the dApp itself is running how to manage part of that treasury. It's also possible the treasury could be sent to a DEX to create an automated market pool, an AMM pool. So I don't think every transfer would need to be done by proposal, but ultimately a proposal is needed to determine how those funds are used. Okay,
thank you very much. So then there are basically maybe on the swap side, what if a swap ends but doesn't succeed? I think you touched on that, but then there was a follow question. If you then need multiple rounds to succeed, will this be subject to a charge for every failed attempt? So I guess we learned what happens if a swap fails, but what would that now really mean for someone who has to maybe try several times to actually succeed in such a initial token swap?
I think the answer at the moment, at least, is that we looked at various options in this, and the simplest solution was to hand it back to the state at the beginning of the whole flow. It was significantly more complicated to kind of hold it in a different state. And so I think the honest answer here is at the moment is that you would have to pay again to go through the whole to go through the process. It's maybe something we can look at more closely, whether we can optimize this better. But we're really hoping that we don't have too many failures.
Yeah, so maybe as a reminder for people that don't know, the idea was that you actually kind of have to start with an initial amount of cycles, right? I guess that's why you refer to you need to pay again, because if you initialize again, then you would again have to kind of invest these initial cycles. But yeah, exactly. Okay, then so someone was asking about what we I guess this is in terms of decentralization, right? So is it correct that right now the best we can do is basically police the participation by principal ID? Yeah, or is there something else we could do?
I think at the moment that is the best that we can do. I mean, it's certainly an area where we're looking at creative solutions. But at the moment, I think it is just that we would participant equals principal.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also the follow-up solution. If now ID solutions or kind of proof of humanity would exist, could this then later be integrated?
I think when that becomes clearer that we can do proof of personhood, or then I think it will be something that we would definitely want to incorporate. Because it's definitely a very useful tool for decentralization. At the moment, we don't have it, so it won't be part of the initial SNS release.
Mm-hmm. Then I think on one slide, it was saying that the percentage of the swap participants has to be larger than the percentage of the developers. And the question is, how can you actually ensure that? Because the voting power also depends not only on the stake tokens, but also on other configurations of the neurons.
Yeah, I think that slide maybe was a bit overly detailed. I think our intention is to verify that the voting outcome will be decentralized, and that obviously isn't just the sum of the tokens. It's also the dissolved delay and the voting weights that are assigned to various dissolved delays, which are also parameters of the SNS that the project can set up themselves. So it's also possible to have a very flat voting hierarchy as part of the configuration if that's what the project desires.
Exactly. So yeah, that was probably just a simplification, right? To say we would actually plan to take that in account, the other attributes of neurons. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. How could you allocate tokens or create neurons to anyone that has invested in a project prior to the swap? So would that be possible?
Yes. So when I say developer neurons, I think that is basically shorthand for sort of anything that's pre-allocated. So developer and earlier investors. And so it will be possible to specify a list of principals that you wish to distribute tokens to.
Great. Then the next question is how does the community fund assigned neurons engage with this process? So I guess the question is, how is this idea of the community fund related to what we just presented?
Yeah, so the community fund is not part of this initial SNS launch. We're planning to release a few more details around that in the coming days and weeks, around how the community fund might actually work, but it will not be part of the initial SNS launch, and so it won't be available for any of the early SNS launches.
Mm-hmm. Then the next question is, can we expect our first SNS event with ADAPT in mid Q3 per carbon milestone? So I'm not entirely sure what that refers to, an SNS event with dApp, whether that refers more to an SNS that is actually created, or the fact that the SNS would have a front end. So I don't know, maybe if you can clarify, or I don't know how you understand. Yeah, so David just answers, yeah, the first SNS that is created. I guess we cannot guarantee that, but yeah.
The $1 million question. I would very much hope that we're in a position in Q3 to start up this initial token swap.
Great.
But no commitments
awesome,
right
thanks. now. Yeah, a suggestion was perhaps this could integrate with people party. So I think that goes back to the question whether once we have this proof of humanity, of proof of personhood, whether that could be integrated.
Absolutely. Oh yes,
yeah.
sorry. People
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, cool. So those, I think, were all the questions that have been answered. Does anyone have new questions? All right. Then, I mean, if you later have any additional questions, we're of course happy to take them in the forum. But I think then we can close this session. Thank you very much for presenting, Pete, and thank you very much everyone for joining and for the questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye.